have my slides up. So when I'm done, I'll kind of exit out of my slide thing so I can see you. And if there's Q&As, right, I can kind of see the actual screen.
Sounds good. We're ready to go now. Whenever you're ready, I'll give you an introduction, and then turn it over to you, and we can go from there. Welcome to our next session. We have with us Dr. Eric Hirschthal, who's a historian of slavery and abolition in the United States. His first book, The Science of Abolition: How Slaveholders Became the Enemies of Progress, from Yale University Press, explored how scientists and Black and white abolitionists use scientific ideas to cast slaveholders as the enemies of modernity. He's currently working on a book about slavery's role in expanding the United States' carbon footprint. Actually, that is the subject of his talk for today. It's entitled Conscripts, Slavery and the Origins of Climate Change in the United States. His research has appeared in a number of different research journals and quarterlies. He's been affiliated with some of the major research centers and institutes such as Yale University's Gilder Lehrman Center for the Study of Slavery Research and Abolition, and the New York Public Library's Schomburg Center for Research in Black Culture. Dr. Hirschthal will talk about carbon conscripts, slavery, and the origins of climate change. And we want to turn it over to you now, Dr. Hirschthal, and again, welcome you and thank you for presenting and sharing your insights and research with us on this 11th annual conference.
Thank you so much, Dr. Williams. And it's great for everyone out there. Unfortunately, I can't see your faces. I see your names. But I'm really grateful for everyone spending the next hour with me. Dr. Ms. Carrington Jones as well. You've been excellent. So thank you for taking the time to really make this session work smoothly. So what I'm going to give you a presentation about is my current research project. I published a couple of articles. I'm working on a larger book, and I'm going to give you the larger outline of my major findings. And that's the role that slavery, and particularly slave-grown agricultural commodities, rice, sugar, tobacco, cotton, played in accelerating our human carbon footprint, beginning in the late 17th, early 18th century, and well through the 19th century. So I want to start with a very brief anecdote. It's a telling scene from Solomon Northup's famous slave narrative, 12 Years a Slave, where he describes in 1842, right, he's captured from freedom in the free North in New York, and he's sent to work on various plantations, but one of them includes a cotton plantation in Louisiana. And he describes one really grueling scene where in 1842, him, another enslaved man named Sam, and 4 enslaved women, Charlotte, Fanny, Cressia, and Nellie, are forced over 5 weeks, likely in the winter months, to clear massive trees, oak trees, sycamores, ultimately for what will likely become a cotton plantation. He describes a grueling scene, right? They're swinging axes into huge tree trunks. They're being forced. Keep in mind, a white overseer with a knife and possibly a pistol is overwatching them. The trees are covered in moss. He writes, it was, even though it was bright daylight, almost the sunlight shut out, the moss coverings shut out the light from the sun. In other words, it was pitch black even during bright daylight because of all the moss and the dense trees. And then he writes, right, just to give more vivid detail, the greatest annoyance I met here were the small flies, the gnats and the mosquitoes. They swarmed the air. They penetrated the porches of the ear, the nose, the eye, the mouth. They sucked themselves beneath the skin. It seemed indeed as if they would devour us, carry us away piecemeal in the small, tormenting mouths. So vivid screen of the really grueling, gruesome work that often isn't seen when we talk about plantations, and that's clearing forest for plantations, any type of plantations, but here we're talking about what is likely a cotton plantation. And I start with this really vivid anecdote, 2 enslaved men and 4 women. This will become important, the women in particular, as I speak, because this story of clearing forests for plantations is central to understanding why racial slavery was a key driver in what I argue in the origins of climate change. As this slide shows, we know this, or scientists know this, or tell us that before 1950, right, that's after World War II, the main human driver of increased human emissions was not the burning of fossil fuels. Whether we're talking about coal or oil or any other fossil fuel, it was deforestation, right? For millennia, humans cleared forests for agriculture, but scientists know that roughly around 1650, 1700, there begins to be an increase globally per capita emissions from clearing forests. And this is, right, one way to mark the origins of increased human emissions. And all of it is coming from forest clearance. The key mechanism that you need to know for those of you who might be wondering, well, how does clearing a forest actually contribute to climate change? It's not when scientists measure how much emissions deforestation contribute to the atmosphere. The mechanism is not because once trees are gone, there's no more carbon to suck down, right? Through photosynthesis, trees grow by pulling down CO2 from the atmosphere. Actually, the main driver is simply when you cut down a tree and either burn it or it slowly rots, the carbon that is the kind of a core backbone of all organic material, including our own bodies, when that decays, that carbon that makes up the building blocks of our cells ultimately gets released into the atmosphere. When you burn a tree, it happens immediately. Cut down a tree and burn it. The carbon stored in the tree goes into the atmosphere immediately. And if it's simply left to rot and decay, it happens over 3, 4, or 5 years, right, as the plant is dying. So that is the main mechanism. So unfortunately, while scientific researchers who have modeled past human climate change have long known that it was deforestation, not fossil fuels, that makes up the vast majority of human emissions prior to the 1950s, even though we all talk about coal, the Industrial Revolution that begins roughly in 1800, they haven't actually looked at, well, what difference does crops make? In other words, do you clear land and therefore deforest more quickly for wheat versus cotton versus tobacco versus any other global commodity or any other global agricultural good? Does it matter whether the person doing it or the people doing that land clearing are enslaved people or free laborers? In other words, can you force enslaved people to clear land more quickly, to exhaust the soil more quickly, which means you need to clear more land? Does the slave labor versus free labor, free meaning non-slave labor, does that make a difference? And any other type of capitalistic form of production. In other words, do societies that are producing goods not only for subsistence to feed themselves, but in addition for commercial purposes, right, to feed a growing profit-driven economy, does that change the rate of land clearance and therefore emissions? Scientists aren't really interested. They have various other ways of kind of estimating past climate change before the era of satellites in the 1960s, and they're not interested in these questions that very much humanities scholars are interested in. And now to turn to the humanities scholars, that's historians, but also people in philosophy departments and African American studies departments. Across the humanities, there's been a big critique in the past decade that scientific models don't, the critique is that scientific models don't take these questions seriously. The role that capitalism, colonialism, and maybe even racial slavery may have played in increasing climate emissions. So there's a robust humanities literature that has given names for the past 500 years to really highlight the potential role that slavery, colonialism, and capitalism may have played. They use terms like the Plantationocene to highlight the role of plantation slavery, or the Capitalocene to highlight the historic role that the global North and the origins of capitalism played in originating our process. But, and here's my critique of these scholars, they don't really take seriously the science. They don't try to model or engage with the science. So what I'm going to present to you today is my attempt to actually wed these two stories, right? To actually take seriously that, hey, maybe colonialism, capitalism, and slavery did play a meaningful role in increasing carbon emissions. And maybe we shouldn't shut out the scientists and only critique them, but maybe we should engage them on their own terms. So my research is basically built off of a collaboration with various climate scientists. who basically taught me how to build a basic, what's called a land use model. A land use model means basically how much land was farmed, how often were they clearing land, and how much carbon was stored in that acre of forest. Once you have those basic details, you can build historical estimates of different type of commodities. Now, as a historian, we have access to amazing existing databases of how much crops were built, and we have we have primary sources, tax lists, and all these other things where we can reconstruct how much different land is being used and clears to really get at some fundamental questions. And here are the bigger questions that was really driving my my research. The first is the basic one: did slave-based agriculture emit more or less carbon than free, which is again non-slave labor? So think colonial and early American Ohio family farms that really begin to populate antebellum Midwest, including places like Ohio. Did the slave-based cotton plantations emit more emissions over a set period of time than, say, the family wheat farms of places like the Midwest and Ohio? Second, how did slave-based emissions compare to the story that occupies everybody's attention? Coal, the first fossil fuel. Keep in mind, around 1780, that's when Watt and Boulton create their first steam engine that will be able to be used in factories, and the first cotton factories beginning in roughly the 1830s in Britain, to a lesser extent America, will be placed in cotton factories, right? Burning coal to produce cotton. What I was interested in as a base question is, did clearance for cotton fields emit more carbon than all the coal burned by not only cotton factories, but all factories and railroads and steamships and all the things that begin to burn coal during this period of the Industrial Revolution? And third and finally, what can the results that I was able to find help us say about the role of slavery in the origins of climate change? So I want to highlight very quickly some big takeaway numbers, and then I'll use it to draft a kind of argument. Maybe the first one is this: between 1650, that's when the British create the first sugar plantations in the British context, right? My research focuses on British America and the early United States, not Brazil and other parts of the world where they're using even where slave labor for sugar plantations is a century ahead of the British context. But in the British context, between 1650 and 1775, slave-grown crops emitted more than 3 times the amount of carbon of every commercial crop grown within colonial America, with or without enslaved labor. So, for example, the major slave-grown commodities of the colonial period: slave-grown sugar in the British Caribbean, rice in South Carolina and Georgia. This is all colonial crops. Tobacco in, of course, Virginia and Maryland. Combined over this period, over this 125-year period, they emit 250,000 TC, means metric tons of carbon, versus all other non-slave-grown crops in the same period, roughly 75 million, therefore 3 million more. The second big data point: in the 18th century, that's when the really slave-based economy of sugar, rice, and tobacco are all being grown by slavery simultaneously. Those 3 slave-grown crops out-emit British coal by nearly 20%, right? 208 million versus 175 million for British coal. The third major point, and now I'm transitioning to after the American Revolution, roughly 1790 is when the new federal government gets up and running. And as importantly, slave-grown cotton in the early 1790s begins to become the new major commodity. It will take 30 years for it to outpass tobacco, but right in 1790, we're seeing the first production of commercial cotton in the United States, produced almost exclusively by enslaved labor. So between 1790 and 1860, up until the Civil War, slave-grown American cotton emits more cotton than any other commercial U.S. crop, slave or free, whether wheat or tobacco grown by enslaved people or rice. And it's responsible for 1/4 of total U.S. emissions in 1850. Finally, over the same 70 years, 1790 to 1860, slave-based cotton fields, or rather land clearance for those cotton fields, emits 20% more carbon than all the coal burned by both the UK, Britain, and the United States combined. And keep in mind, 1790 to 1860s, this is precisely the heart of the Industrial Revolution, which in mainstream understanding is when climate change begins, right? Industrial revolution for many people and scientists too represents the birth of a fossil-based economy. What my numbers show is that if we're counting by the metrics of actual carbon emissions, it's the cotton fields, not the cotton factories, where the origins of climate change truly lie. So my argument, based off of some of these bigger findings, right? The origins of today's climate crisis lie in the fields, not the factories. For nearly 2 centuries, slave-based land clearance outpaced fossil fuel emissions burned in the world's most advanced economies, right? Up until slavery ends, slavery was the dominant driver of increasing human emissions, not fossil fuels vis-a-vis coal. Secondly, and this will be important, this will help structure the remainder of my talk, but racial exploitation alone cannot explain why slavery emitted so much carbon. It was only some slave-grown crops, as we will see, that really were huge carbon drivers of carbon intensification, while certain other ones, like rice, as we will see, actually emitted very little carbon. And the way to properly understand slavery's importance to the origins of climate change is to understand, first and foremost, racial exploitation is foundational, but not enough on its own to explain why carbon emits so much carbon. Every slave plantation was embedded within a broader economy, what sometimes a more fancy word we might call political economy, how politics shapes the economy. It was embedded within an environment, and it was embedded within certain cultural systems, right? Different racialized gender norms, what type of women are allowed to work in the fields and not, that's culturally constructed. Different modes of enslaved resistance plays a role in shaping what crops become carbon intensive and not, as we will see. And even African agricultural knowledge shapes the degree to which certain slave-grown crops and others ones not become so carbon intensive, right? So for the remainder of the talk, what I will do is really highlight each of these factors by comparison in the first section of this of the remainder. Colonial tobacco, why it's the key driver, why it's the largest emitter in colonial North America. I will compare it to rice, which is very low. And I will also compare slave-grown tobacco plantations to what precedes it, which is indentured white servants who were also exploited, but 7-year contracts, freed after 7 years and given their own land, something that, of course, never happens to enslaved Africans who are succeed white indentured servants. So I want to make those two comparisons to help us really understand what it is about slavery that makes certain slave-grown crops carbon intensive. And then I'll move on for the second half, looking at the broader, looking at the early 19th century, the United States, and trying to understand why cotton in particular is such an enormous driver of climate change when cotton emerges as the new slave-grown cotton in the United States. So very quickly, what this slide really shows is cumulative emissions. By that, I mean, over the same 70-year period, how much carbon was emitted for land clearance for these crops. The middle section here, as you can see, beginning with the third vertical bar from the right, that's where you see the enslaved grown crops. So we start with enslaved grown tobacco. That's the 89 million metric tons. On top of that is some slave grown grain, mainly corn and also some wheat, over from 1700 to 1775. The next one, and this is what I'll come back to, is slave grown rice. Slave grown rice has very low emissions, lower even than the first two bars on the left. The very first is indentured, which is not slavery, coerced labor, but not slavery. Slave-grown rice has less cumulative emissions over a similar 70-year period than white indentured servant tobacco plantations. And just as importantly, in the same exact period, northern free farmers are emitting more carbon to clear land for wheat farms in places like Pennsylvania than enslaved laborers are cumulatively than slave laborers are emitting carbon in the rice plantations of Georgia and South Carolina. The third one is, of course, sugar, which vies with tobacco as a huge emitter of carbon. And then the second to last thing is combining all of those slave-grown commodities. And we see when you combine them all, right? That's the second to last vertical column, and the highest one, that's all slave-grown commodities in the 18th century. And that, of course, emits more than British coal, which by this point has already transitioned to most of its energy use from coal. So let me now break it down. First, trying to explain, right, what is it that's making, maybe the best comparison is slave-grown tobacco. Is slavery roughly at the turn of the 18th century, 1700 to 1705. Racialized African labor becomes the dominant source of labor for tobacco plantations. But the 70 years prior, or I'm going to, from roughly 1619, or really 1616, but 1619 for a similar time frame, to 1690, the dominant labor force used for tobacco in colonial Chesapeake is, of course, white indentured servants. Again, serving for 7 years. The owner can whip them, beat them, what have you, but they're signing a contract, and at the end of that contract, they're free, and they are given, right, their 50 acres to maybe start at their own tobacco farm, or maybe even a tobacco plantation. So both coerced labors, but obviously quite different in terms of the intensity. So what is it about actual racial slavery that's making tobacco plantations emit cumulatively, this is the top bar, roughly 3 times more carbon than indenture-grown tobacco? That's the top one. That's cumulative emissions. And then when you model the average size individual plantation, the average indenture plantation has, this is the bottom graph, has about half the emissions of the average slave-grown, of the average slave-based tobacco plantation in the 18th century. So what explains this? I think the key thing really to highlight here, right, is to realize first and foremost that both indenture tobacco, realize how they're similar. Both tobacco plantations, whether worked by white indentured servants or enslaved African labor, are basically rapidly exhausting the soil. Every 3 years, they're clearing new land for tobacco fields. The old tobacco fields are grown with corn for another 3 years to basically feed the enslaved population and the slave owner. But every 3 years, right, they're monocropping and rapidly exhausting the soil. So that doesn't explain the difference. They're both rapidly clearing the soil. They're both, of course, being grown in the same general region, the Chesapeake, Virginia, and Maryland. They're both feeding the same kind of mercantilist or merchant capitalist economy. All of that tobacco is being shipped on British ships to England, which England will then sell that tobacco domestically and across the globe. Right? So all those factors are basically equal. So therefore, this now allows us to isolate. It's not the environment. It's not the land use practice. It's not the economy, right? It must have something to do with slavery. So what is it about slavery? And here's where I think gender, right, plays a fundamental role in really understanding what's going on here. Most importantly, slave plantations are using enslaved women, not only men, for labor, and that immediately doubles the size of the labor pool. Right, you have twice as many enslaved workers. You can clear twice as much land. Therefore, you have twice as much emissions, and that's what's happening at the household level. But it's not only the fact that women are being used. Right, indentured servants, this isn't already clear, are only white men. Right, young men in particular, right? European cultural norms dictate that you do not force women into hard agricultural labor, but white enslavers are saying, but for Black women, there's an exception, right? While planters clearly prefer men under a perception, right or wrong, that men are somehow more capable in this physical labor, they nonetheless willingly accept women as hard agricultural labor. So doubling the amount of pool, not just men, but women, doubles the amount of tobacco, doubles the amount of land clearance. So that's fundamental to it. Really, it's a gender story or gender norms around labor. And then relatedly, of course, is if you think about it, right, once you start to have women in the fields, you're also having, because of the laws created for racial slavery, you're entrapping enslaved women's children, right? So you have a lot more younger people, right, by age 9 or 10, enslaved children are being forced into the fields to work regular labors. At younger ages, they're also doing small tasks around the fields. And you have women and older people. So in theory, right, that demographic shouldn't be able to clear as much land as an average young man, which is the indentured servant population, right? And yet we know from the best studies that the average enslaved person, averaged across all ages and genders, young, old, men, women, is clearing roughly the same amount of land as the average white young male indentured servant. this is where the story of violence is clear. And this is what we know, right? Once the era of racial slavery begins, planters are getting rid of Saturdays are no longer off. Even Sundays, the one day off, it's up to the plantation owner versus white indentured servant. You don't mess with those days. Christmas and various other Christian holidays are completely not given during the colonial period. There's no rule that enslaved people necessarily have those days off. Many of them are not Christian, of course, but Europeans are no interest in Christianizing them during the colonial period, and therefore not giving them any of these holidays off. And economic historians know that over the course of the year, the average enslaved worker is working about a month more, 26 more days per year than the average indentured worker. So how do you make this demographic, children, women, older, when averaged together, meet the same requirements as young white men? The reason is you have to work them harder, right? So this comparison, right, you have to get rid of all those luxuries and make sure that your enslaved people are producing as much tobacco as possible. So here we are really seeing, right, the cleanest natural experiment. And I think what really explains why slavery is having more emission than indentured, both capitalistic forms, is because of racial norms and gender norms, right? You're throwing women into the field and you're forcing men, women, and children to work at the extraordinary rate. So there we can say, yes, violence and gender norms is central to explaining part of why some crops like tobacco are such large carbon emitters. Now, the next one I want to turn to, also the colonial period, is thinking about slave-grown rice. And rice is the anomaly. As you can see here, rice is the gold on the right. When you're comparing rice, I'm just blowing up that earlier large overview. Rice grows emits cumulatively, the top graph, much less carbon than the purple one is northern wheat and corn, right? Much less, and certainly much less than tobacco. So why is rice the anomaly? And here, I think basically everything flows down from land use. That is to say, rice plantations, unlike tobacco plantations, are not constantly exhausting the soil and clearing land every 3 to 4 years. In fact, because of irrigated rice fields, right, where you're bringing in outside water from rivers, using tidal flows to bring in ocean swells to basically flood a rice field 3 or 4 times a year. It's a massive groundworks. It requires canals, very sophisticated for the time, technological expertise. Because of that irrigated system, rice fields do not exhaust. Now, you can grow rice through rainfall, and if you can monocrop rice, it will exhaust the soil. But if you do irrigated rice, right, that the nutrients from those outside waters replenishes the soil, and therefore rice plantations clear land at a much slower rate, not only than tobacco, but than wheat and all other crops, right? For 40 to 60 years, you can grow rice on the same field, tobacco every 3 to 4 years, wheat, based on the practices that were wheat farmers, maybe every 30 years, right? So these things are not clearing land and therefore emitting much less carbon. And this is why I think it's a fascinating story, right? As historians have long argued, while we can't attribute all of rice agriculture to African knowledge, we know that Senegambians were critical knowledge producers of how to grow rice. Northern Europeans don't know how to do it. They're not trying to grow rice. But as we know, the significant number of Senegambians who come to the Low Country bring rice irrigation technology, agricultural knowledge to the Low Country. And it's this technology that is really why there's irrigated rice and less carbon emissions. There's a whole downstream effect from irrigated rice, some of them not so pretty. And that helps explain low carbon emissions, right? Once you're doing irrigated rice, these plantations, many of them by the end of the colonial period, are dependent on tidal waves. They need to be close to the ocean. So unlike tobacco, you can't march them into the interior. They're pinned to the Atlantic seaboard. Rice, as we know, you're in wet, humid environments. Women are up to their knees and men in these rice fields. These are deadly disease environments, so much so that we have what's called natural decrease. Deaths are exceeding births, and enslaved women cannot be forced to give birth quickly enough to replenish the labor supply. What that means is that managing a rice plantation for the slave owner is very expensive. And if something's more expensive, less people are doing it, right? So basically the deadly disease environment, which stems from the irrigation, leads to more, the higher labor costs because you need to constantly replenish the labor supply. And that limits the amount of people who are able to grow rice, limits the amounts of rice, limits rice emissions. And finally, the last thing, and this highlights the point of slave resistance, is I want to really realize that a unique way of laboring enslaved rice growers emerges in the Carolinas, which is unique to rice. And that's what's known as the task system. Basically, an enslaved person is given a task. You do this, you can do it in 5 hours, 10 hours, 20 hours. As soon as you're done, you have your time to your own. The reason, or at least one of the reasons planters developed this system is because of the deadly disease environment. They want enslaved workers to get out of those swampy mosquito-borne disease fields as quickly as possible. So they incentivize them to work as quickly by saying, I'm not going to work you from sun up to sundown, right? As soon as you're done, I'll put you in the next field. I'm going to incentivize you by you get your work done, then you can work your own personal garden to feed yourself. Well, enslaved resistance is an important role because as this task system becomes entrenched, we see lots of evidence of enslaved people resisting their owners anytime they try to switch to the more tightly managed gang system, which means I have a gang, I force you to do this. When you're done, great. We're going to move on to the next assignment. So enslaved people are constantly resisting attempts to get rid of the gang system, so much so that, as we famously know, think Gullah Geechee people, right, who are also forced to grow cotton. Everywhere else in the cotton system outside of Gullah Geechee, which begins as a rice growing region and emerges in the 19th century as a cotton growing region, that's the only region where the task system remains, despite the fact that cotton planters hate it. And the reason it resists, or at least an important reason, is because enslaved people refuse to give it up, right? It gives them a modicum control over their time. Again, so as we see, right, a whole cascade of events stemming from this African developed irrigation system limits the extent of rice emissions. Now, the last thing I want to turn to is the 19th century and understand why cotton, which emerges as the main carbon commodity in between 1790 and 1860, why it blows every other commodity out of the water. The second largest, northern wheat in purple, as you can see, this is cumulative emissions, this graph. Cotton clearance for cotton fields, right, surpasses British and coal combined, right? That's the black and gray. Black is British coal, gray is America. And then on and on. And on the right, just to really highlight the importance of coal, by 1850, 25% of global emissions, right? So basically what I'm saying here is the United States emerges as the United States emerges as the world's largest national carbon emitter by 1850. They're responsible for 25% of global emissions, the United States, our country. And the next step, 25% of those emissions from the United States comes from clearing cotton fields alone. That is the largest source of emissions. 75% comes from elsewhere, wheat and other things, but the largest one is clearly cotton. On a global scale, 7 to 8% of global emissions by 1850 are from forcing enslaved people to clear land. And if we measure on a per capita basis, right, the average enslaved worker just to clear cotton plantations is being forced to emit 24 times more cotton than the global average. Most of the world is still doing subsistence agriculture, and it's 8.5 times cotton emissions per capita per enslaved worker than the average wheat farmer who is also growing wheat for the growing urban cities. So the main thing that I really want to highlight here is looking at why cotton, for example, emits so much more carbon than tobacco during the 19th century. And here, right, both of them are exhaustive. Cotton, critically, the fundamental driver, is also exhausting the land every 3 to 4 years, basically the same land use practices. But the real difference here is the political economy of cotton. Cotton, unlike tobacco, becomes embedded in the emerging world of industrial capitalism. Think wage labor and factories, right? And the beginnings of coal-powered steam engines in factories, right? This is roughly 1780 to 1860. The first dominant commodity to fuel those early wage-based factories is, of course, cotton factories worked by poor, young, exploited women and children in England, white women in England, as well as places like Lowell, Massachusetts, right? Socially degraded labor. They're seen as not being worth being paid as much because they're either women or they're children. Similar story on a racial basis for enslaved workers, right? So cotton feeds that workforce. 1 out of 6 British industrial workers by the 1850s works for the cotton industry. Over 60% of them are young, single women and children. And they're not getting rich off of this. They're simply getting enough poverty wages to feed themselves. So cotton feeds an industrial capitalist wage labor force that's emerging in England in a way that tobacco does, that never does, because tobacco requires basically no manufacturing, right? Raw cotton, after it's ginned and you just have the fibers, the factories are turning it into yarn and then weaving it into cloth that can then be sold throughout the world. Tobacco, you pretty much dry it, roll it up, and either use it as snuff or smoke it. So cotton, even though, again, same land use practice, same demand, doesn't feed an industrial labor force. And that's the political economy. Cotton is central to the emergence of industrial capitalism. For the sake of time, I'm going to stop there. And I want to basically highlight my main conclusions. And the first one is this, right? Really to highlight my major point, which is to say, long before fossil fuels became the main source of human emissions, slave-based agriculture played an outside role in expanding our collective carbon footprint. While racial exploitation was central to slavery's carbon toll, it is not sufficient on its own to explain why some slave-grown crops and not others, see rice, drove that expansion, right? That's why the term that I use is a plantation carbon complex. The plantation was embedded within economic, ecological, gender norms, cultural norms, etc., that really explain its carbon intensity. And what, of course, for the sake of this panel, what are the present day implications? Well, one, I think, is the obvious one. African Americans, the poor, and people throughout the global South continue to bear the worst consequences of climate change, not because the climate cares, but because they're built environments, right? They don't have the resources to basically mitigate the worst of climate change. What this research, I think, helps support is the idea that the wealthiest societies in the world, not the United States, obviously on a global scale, but the wealthiest Americans individually have a historical responsibility to basically help the poorest communities, which are disproportionately Black and brown, weather the worst of climate change. But beyond, and this is the final point, beyond the story of a better, more equitable redistribution of resources so that we all can weather the storm together, we need to be thinking about what the implications are for forward-looking that this research really highlights. And one is, I think, a story that's beneath all of this is the exploitation or valuing different people's labor otherwise. Our carbon intensity, whether in the era of slavery and continually till today, depends on socially devaluing some people's labor more than others, right? We all know that the service economy depends off of poor white people, poor Black and brown people disproportionately. And we all know that even in our supposed coming green economy, right, that the raw materials often come from places like Africa, Latin America, poor rural white communities, right? And we are devaluing, because of their poverty or their race and poverty, we are devaluing, right, their land and their labor. And therefore, what this story, I think, shows us is that if we really want to address some of the root causes, it's not just taking the environment seriously, it's taking everybody's labor seriously and really paying everybody their fair share. And once we begin to value everybody's labor, we will see that the intense carbon emissions that comes from our racially unequal environment will actually will be checked or will be reduced once we begin to address the labor inequalities that undergird our economy. So with that, I will end, and I will leave the remaining, what I take to be 15 minutes or so, for questions.
Great, Dr. Hershaw, thank you so much. That was a incredible, insightful presentation, and we looking forward to when your book comes forward, because it's incredible work that brings together a lot of sort of interrelated subjects over a sort of a long historical period, and it is very invaluable scholarship. And so, thank you for presenting that. And how it relates to this conversation of resilience and environmental determinants and environmental protections. My first question is, could you speak about the correlation between the political economy of racial capitalism, race-based climate change, as you're talking about, and its spatial situatedness in plantation-based colonial economies? That is fascinating. And the ways in which you're talking about the coal and its relationship to carbon and the plantation as a site, but also the gender factor in there, and the ways in which it still has influence today. If you could speak to that, we'd appreciate it.
So, Dr. Williams, I'm sorry. Can you just maybe just do it one more time? I'm not sure I got all the question. Just to, yeah. If you mind repeating.
Yeah. Well, the major question is the correlation between the political economy of racial capitalism, the sort of race-based climate change, and just the spatial situatedness, particularly in southern-based, colonial economies, and just how you talk about the relationship between field and factory, and even the ways in which cotton, has more of a contribution to climate emissions versus coal, and why is that relevant today when you talk about global political economies and this whole conversation over climate change?
Okay, there's a lot there, so let me at least try to address some of it. I think, as I mentioned right before, it's, there's unquestionably that today and since the 1950s, coal is a huge, our per capita emissions globally is much higher because we're burning a lot of coal. By 1950, the share of emissions that come from that come from fossil fuels, at that point, not just coal, by the 1950s, it's oil. 51% of human emissions are coming from burning fossil fuels, predominantly by the 1950s, oil, but also coal. But the other 50% is land use. Land use is a fancy way of saying essentially deforestation. And we all eat, and much of our food originates, even animals, right? You need to clear the land for pasture. Much of that land comes from clearing land. So while coal, right, dominates our attention for good reason, because today, if we're looking, I think 85% of human emissions is from coal versus 15% from land use. Again, deforestation, right? At the period that I'm talking about, it's essentially the reverse. In 1870, globally, I'm talking about, 85% of human emissions comes from deforestation for agriculture and 15% from fossil fuels. So I don't want to say that, right, we can explain all of what happens based off of this story, where essentially my story ends when slavery ends, but it's an origin story. It's not an ending story, right? We need other historians to explain what's happening in the 20th century long after slavery is dead. Obviously, new forms of racial capitalism, right? Jim Crow sharecropping in the South, but really it's a global story. And in many ways, it doesn't pattern on the white-black binary that so defines, right, the 18th and 19th century and much of American history, right? It's a much more global story where other social inequalities are compelling. For example, right, the Japanese in the 20th century to coerce labor out of Manchurians as they begin to industrialize in the 20th century. So there are other pieces to this story. And the climate story, right, the story of human carbon emission accelerates per capita over time. And again, by the mid-20th century, coal takes over. So I don't want to discount the other stories where slavery, frankly, has nothing to do with, at least not in a direct way. What I want to do is tell an origin story in which it's very clear that for millennia, humans were fundamentally clearing land to feed themselves, with the emergence roughly around 1500 of a commercial, let's call it merchant capitalist, as to distinguish it from industrial capitalism, wage-based labor of the 19th century. Once you begin to grow, not to clear land, not just to feed yourselves, but to make a profit, That's where we see indentured white servants beginning to have more than simply subsistence farmers. And once you add slaves to that, enslaved labor, and you can coerce them to do basically as much as physically possible, then you have another, and that gets us back to my first slide, right? Why does slave labor tobacco have more than indenture labor tobacco? They're both capitalistic, right? Both of those labor forces are producing not just subsistence corn to feed themselves, but tobacco to make a profit for their owner. But the slave-based labor is even larger. And again, my argument is that it has a lot to do with gender, right? If you are saying, hey, we don't work women hard in the field, as therefore indentured servants can only be white men, but for African slaves, you can say, well, we don't really care. Yes, we prefer men, but 50% of the labor force by 1750 enslaved labor force is black men and black women. All of a sudden, you have more laborers and way more cotton. And you can even force them, again, women and children, to work at the rate of men through the laws that empower slaveholders to force slaves to work as much as the owner sees fit.
Fascinating research, and when you're looking at the correlations between the types of labor, as you say, as you talk about the indentured labor, and Peter Kolch and others talk about that, and how that then segues to the sort of plantation-based economy of labor of enslaved peoples, and even the differentiation between genders, but how it's all part of a larger system, and even how it also relates to today, and not just past, but shows the value of history, the correlative factors of it, and how it influences what happens now. But also commend you for talking about the ways in which science and sort of the origin stories you're saying is also interrelated with the humanities and the social sciences. When we look at how people try to create these separate spheres of what's going on in the sciences and science-based, not only scholarship, but information or data, the quantitative, qualitative piece, but it's all interrelated because it's all part of an integrated system, just like it's part of an integrated global economy. That's interesting. And how would you say, in terms of in speaking to communities such as in Northeast Ohio, and speaking communities, that now are facing data centers and the pushback of that have also been impacted by generations, particularly in southern states, but also those with southern sensibilities who moved north and west and elsewhere, of how to use what you're sharing in your research to undergird and support their efforts in neighborhoods and communities. What would you say as it relates to the translation of it to sort of public scholarly use, as you were talking about the land bank issue? How can they use your research to be able to inform their efforts in neighborhoods and communities?
It's a great question. I mean, the obvious one is climate justice, right? I mean, if there's a way to say, look, the exploitation of disproportionately black and brown people got us to this crisis, and therefore there's a responsibility for the wealthiest communities who contributed to that exploitation to help those communities weather the worst of it. I mean, that is in many ways the simplest way to understand how this is quote unquote usable, right? I mean, obviously, right? I mean, I'm doing an academic thing, and I'm really trying to understand, and that's the nuance, right? It's not all types of slavery, right? So my project doesn't necessarily lend itself. Slavery everywhere always means that you have an ethical responsibility to help the communities who you exploited weather the worst of it. But broadly speaking, I think that is a very obvious consequence. It's in the local. I think the other, and this is why I highlighted it in my concluding thought. The second one is probably the slightly more subtle one, and I need to find a better way to articulate it. But really, what's going on here, right, is you can clear so much land because labor is cheap. And labor is cheap because you don't value black labor as much as you do white ones. We see that the difference between racial slavery and indentured labor, and we see it on the gender role, right? Black women, we can force them into field. White women, we don't do that, right? You force black women, you're increasing your carbon emissions because you're doubling the labor pool. So there's an abstract principle here that I think does can be traced even to today's economy, right? Even the data centers, it's not labor, but it's land, right? poor people's land. We see this, of course, in Louisiana, and I'm sure this is similar. It's not only Black people, though, right? It's disproportionately Black people. I live in Utah. The poor white rural communities up north, just to their great hats off to them. And I think the speaker just before me mentioned how inspiring it was that rural white, disproportionately Trump voters, and more urban or rural Black communities, which are more Democrat, actually have common cause in this, right? And that's because the poor whites aren't valued, their land isn't valued, and therefore rich people can put the data centers there. And similarly, in the poor Black communities in the South and other parts of the country, your land isn't valuable, and therefore we can put a data center there, right? This is a pattern that certainly begins in slave labor. The land being taken, if we're just looking at land, is of course Native American, but the labor being taken is disproportionately Black, right? We don't value you, and therefore we will create a system of labor, the most exploitative the world has ever seen, racial slavery, and we will therefore force you to clear land at an exceptional clip. That through line of devaluing people's worth, if we want to put labor and land together in one category, is central to climate change. When you do that, you can make a lot of profit, you can emit a lot of carbon.
It's incredible conversation. No, we have a question in the chat, and just want to also share. I mean, it's insightful how you're talking about how this also spans the local, the global, and the transnational, and the ways where it also speaks to the global history of capitalism, and the global South's push for loss and damage. Restitution, and how the descendants of those in the Caribbean who are part of that global South conversation and the African Union also are those who were among those who, resided in those southern states, who were on those fields and in those spaces, and how it all kind of comes full circle. And someone who comes from South Carolina, when you talk about the Peter Wood and the work of Black majority in the with the 1800s, even before, it's interesting to see how cotton, where the factories and the mills fuel that early economic basis, and then segues into all those other spaces and all. So it's fascinating work. Felina Selden, who's an administrator, asked the question: what is one practical way cities can help residents connect day-to-day survival issues, as it relates to housing, bills, and health, to the bigger climate justice story, and how can we make the whole question about carbon more sort of palpable for people who are who are in spaces and places, and to make it relevant and pertinent to them. I mean, what would you say to people who may have questions about that?
Yeah, I mean, I don't have the data points right off the top of my hand, but I think many of us know in this conference, right, that poor communities, disproportionately Black and Latino, face urban environments where there are less trees, and therefore climate change. The climate doesn't care whether you have trees or not, but because we have constructed a built environment where poor people have less shade, less access to green spaces, there is deaths caused by, every summer, the heat waves disproportionately affect Black and brown communities. That's climate change, right? Saying basically, your Black and brown communities are going to feel the brunt of what climate change is doing, because you as a society have chosen to not invest in public parks, to make those cement environments and all that. And what I think this data can show, right, is that, this is a very old story. We have seen this kind of, again, the same racialized pattern of exploitation that we are seeing now has roots in the slave-based economy that got this whole thing started. And therefore, right, if they want to see, I mean, I think, people have a historical bent, but even for the activists, right, they can say, look, city, governor, Mayor, you have a responsibility for our communities because of slavery, because of Native American land disposition, and then for all the migrants since who, because of lack of economic opportunity, are forced to live in those poor environments, right? Latin Americans, any other type of immigrants are forced to live in those hotter environments that are dying at disproportionate rate to heat stroke and all the rest, right? All of this has a very deep history, and therefore this numbers can be used to advocate for those very real policies like we need more green spaces in our neighborhood.
Yeah, Dr. Hershaw, I want to thank you so very much. You have a very invaluable and incredible study and work that we look forward to seeing once it's published, and it's of great value too to communities and networks and neighborhoods, beyond academia, but also who are influenced, by your work. And that of other scholars who are working this area. So thank you for pioneering that work and continuing to bridge those gaps and for presenting for us today. I think our network and our conferences has been enriched, with your scholarship. And so again, want to thank you so much for presenting, and again, look forward to hearing more from your work in the future. So thank you so much.
Thank you all. It was a real pleasure and treat to be here.
Thank you. And as you mentioned, you said you went to Ohio State, right?
I was a postdoc there for just before COVID for 2 years. Yeah.
Yeah, postdoc. We talked about that earlier.
Yes.
Yeah. So it's good, to know, how everything comes full circle, and so we appreciate your Ohio connections as well, and know that you're doing great work in Utah, and again look forward to hearing more about your work. So thank you all so much.
Thank you guys.
Best wishes to you.
Okay.
We have lunchtime coming up. We know we've had a power-packed first half, and that shows you the value of the work of the Northeast Ohio Community Resilience Center and our executive director, Ivanka Hall, and all of those who have contributed not only to this conference, but to the everyday work of the Northeast Ohio Community Resilience Center in a time in which we live in, which we all know the kind of not only the climate with regard to our environmental space, but also on every level of society, local, state, and federal level. So it is a Herculean effort, but of a number of amazing leaders, including our executive director and all of you who helped make this possible, and all of the great work that you're doing in your organizations and groups. And so we're thankful to partner with you. Also, we want to recognize Chair of Department of African American Studies at Louisiana State University, Professor Stephen Finley, author of a number of different works on Black religion and phenomenology, who's also in attendance. And so, everyone, want to thank you for being here today, where we're bridging all the gaps and the borders and the spaces between academia, between the community, between the neighborhood, the hood, between green spaces and places, and everywhere else. So we hope that you'll enjoy your lunch and come back after lunch and join us for a great presentation by Dr. Allison Caban-Holt of the Maya Angelou Center for Research in Healthy Communities, who will present on subjects related to her work on racial disparities in Alzheimer's dementia, which you don't want to miss. And the second half will be just as insightful and impactful and full of great information, insight, data, and analysis, and relevance and resilience. So thank you all so much. And again, we also want to thank Catherine Coleman Flowers for her incredible work and presentation, Dr. David Paget, and again, Dr. Eric Hershaw for joining us earlier. Enjoy your lunch. We will see you on the other side of this lunch break.